hoping that what you need me to do.
Perfect. That's
Okay,
perfect.
got it. All right. So this is something that it's a topic that I find really important. And I don't think it's talked about enough. There's not enough research on it. So first of all, I'll say that I honestly believe, and I say this all the time, I think adoptees are some of the strongest people on earth. We have experienced things in our lives, especially many of us at very young ages, that most people can't even fathom. So I think it's incredibly important that we name that and honor that part of ourselves. We have strength, we have resilience, and while it's not fair the ways that those things had to develop, we can own that. We earned it. So how does that become pathologized? Why is that something that so often then gets turned into things like, oh, this person has reactive attachment disorder, or oppositional defiant disorder, or all these things where the focus is on the adopted person is somehow having the problem, when really we're just having normal reactions to an abnormal event that occurred, right? So it's my mission to flip that, to help people understand the ways in which the things that they might typically pathologize are actually incredibly adaptive, incredibly resilient, things that are actually really amazing. And essentially, to me, I think sometimes are like superpowers. All right, so we're going to look at this through the lens of the 7 core issues. And so for those of you who are familiar with these, I'm sure, this will be something that you can kind of tune out for a minute if you need to kind of shut your brain down if you've been at the conference and doing a lot of listening today. For those of you who are not familiar, I would encourage you, you can Google this and find a ton of information. There are books, I'll have resources at the end on one of the last slides. But these are sort of the framework that I use when I work with clients. And when I think of my own experiences as an adoptee, they really resonate. So these are things that not every adoptee experiences all the time, in the same way, but things that most adoptees will experience at least some of the time throughout their lives. And there tends to be a lot of interconnectedness within these issues. So you'll notice some overlap too. But first of all, when we're talking about loss, right, that first issue, there's a fear of abandonment and letting go. And for obvious reasons, right? We've already lost so much. It makes sense that we're going to try and do everything we can not to lose more. And oftentimes, when you think of loss, I want you to think of it as being synonymous with change, because any change involves loss. Moving to a new location, getting a new job, even someone rearranging the furniture in your house is a change. So there's a loss of the familiar. And so I think it's important for us to name that as adoptees, that loss isn't just the big stuff. Sometimes it's also the small daily things that are occurring. And rejection, then, there is a sensitivity of worth. When we're talking about rejection, it's that sense of, am I worth keeping? Am I good enough? Because no matter how much we might understand the reasons that we were relinquished or separated from our first families on an intellectual level, there's often a disconnect between what we know intellectually and what we feel or believe. And no matter the reasons, it can still always feel like somehow we were not enough and there was something about us that was less than. And so it can be a hard thing to reconcile that disconnect, and that leads to that sensitivity of rejection. Guilt and shame are about what we do and who we are, but they often get meshed together for adoptees or those who've experienced a lot of trauma. That guilt becomes, it's like, oh, I made a mistake. And instead of it being, oh, I made a mistake, no big deal, I'm a good person, I'll fix it, it becomes, I made a mistake. What's wrong with me? I'm terrible. No one's ever going to love me again. It goes right to that place of shame. So when there's not much of a boundary between those, it does lead to a lot of internal negativity. Grief, I think the parts of that that are sort of at face value are grief in mourning and angst around the losses and all of the unknowns and what ifs. But a lot of times grief also looks like curiosity because there's so much that's unknown. There are so many what ifs when it comes to our adoption narratives, that in our daily lives and other relationships, we want all the information, right? I'm going to ask all the questions. I need all the details. I need to know all the reasons why. And that's a way that we are trying to protect ourselves from feeling any more loss or any more unknowns. Identity is all about our roots and our purpose. Who do we come from? Where do we come from? Why are we here? What does it mean? All of those really big questions that span the range of who we are and how we're perceived by others on a daily basis, to those more kind of philosophical and existential questions about our meaning and being on this earth. Intimacy, a lot of times they equate that with attachment, which is the word we hear a lot in the adoption world. It's really about how do we bond with others? How do we build relationships? What does our interpersonal functioning look like? All of these things that really come together when we're talking about what it means to exist in the world, because we are inherently social creatures. So what does that look like? How do we engage? How do we step back and protect ourselves? All of that is part of intimacy. And then finally, control. Control is something that often gets a bad rap, right? When we think of someone being controlling, we think, oh, that's not a good thing. There's a lot of stigma. But truthfully, at its root, control is just about wanting to be safe and have things be predictable, wanting to know what's expected of you, what to expect of others or the environment around you, which truthfully, that's something that everybody wants, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. So you can see how a lot of these may connect with each other, right? Like, for instance, if we're fearing loss or rejection, how we might control that by rejecting first or not becoming too attached to something. So all of these things, I think you'll probably resonate with ways that maybe they've shown up in your lives. And instead of these issues only being things that cause struggles in our life, I want to talk about the ways that they actually exist on a continuum to cause, maybe struggles at times, but also ways that they can be incredible assets to us as well. All right. So when we talk about loss, we're talking about that fear of abandonment and letting go, anything that involves change. So, like I said, there may be some resistance to any more change or transition. We've had our fill of it already, right? So it makes sense that we're going to say, I don't really want any more of that. But that also means we are more likely to stick with challenging situations, right? We're not likely to just give up at the first sign of adversity. Many of us are willing to stick with something that's hard, whether it's a task, a job, an assignment, a relationship. We do our best to stick with it because we're trying to avoid loss. And many times that can end up being a positive. Now, the other side of this is that to avoid loss, you may remain in harmful relationships or environments. But again, when it's a relationship that's positive or can be repaired, that ability to maintain long-term relationships tend to be a strength for many adoptees, that they have friends they've known since childhood well into their late adulthood, because that drive to not experience loss allows them to stay connected consistently. So on the more difficult end of this, where there's struggle, there might be an avoidance or disruption of plans. So again, if I don't engage in something, I can't lose it. So to avoid engaging or to kind of stop something when it feels like it's getting to that point where there's more attachment or more meaning, that can be the side of the continuum that harms us. But when we shift to that other side of the continuum, it also means that we tend to be more tolerant and forgiving. So again, in relationships and situations, there's that awareness of if we don't want to experience loss, that means that I have to be willing to compromise, to make some exceptions, to have more empathy for the context of the situation or the other person. So again, those are things that can be incredibly positive. And I mean, tolerance and forgiveness are certainly things that we could use more of in our world today. All right, so when it comes to rejection, when we look at this spectrum, many of us recognize the ways that that fear of rejection can lead to excessive people pleasing, right? Accommodating everyone else's needs, our needs essentially disappearing as soon as another person's needs exist in the same space. But the flip side of that is that when it comes to contributing in cooperative ways, we can do an amazing job. You know, the fact that we want others to be proud of us or to appreciate what we're contributing means that when we work in a group, oftentimes those cooperative tasks are something we can excel in. So again, when we go to the more difficult side of the continuum, there may be some isolating or distancing or disconnecting, and that's part of that. I'm going to reject before I can be rejected. But again, on the other end of the continuum is the idea that that means we're putting toward greater effort to maintain relationships when we do feel a sense of connection or commitment, that we stay very loyal and dedicated to the people who are safe and who are very meaningful to us. Now, that fear of rejection, oftentimes on more challenging end of the continuum, it means that there may be a struggle with self-harming types of behaviors. You know, if I don't feel good enough, I may be punishing myself. I may be treating myself in ways that I believe I deserve, even if they're very harsh. And again, the other end of the continuum ends up being that there is an acceptance and integration of feedback, that if you're afraid of rejection, you're going to listen to other people's input about you. And while we don't want it to go so far as being the only input that we accept, it's helpful to be able to self-reflect and be in that space of awareness around how we're impacting the people around us or how they perceive us, and integrate that feedback to help us be our best selves. So you'll start to notice with a lot of this, it's about a balance, right? Not going from one full end of the spectrum to the other, but finding ways to be more centered or to be more on that end of finding how these can be assets for us, these traits. All right, so when we talk about guilt and shame, like I said, they can very easily be meshed. And it's important to, oh, let's see, April, yes, you should be
Forgive
seeing
me.
my slide.
We're not. I am not, at least. I don't know. So interesting. I wonder if other folks are having, okay, that's
Oh,
me. For some reason, I
okay.
don't see them, but it's my issue. I just wanted to make sure other folks
Oh,
weren't.
okay. Yeah.
Forgive me.
That's
Okay,
strange.
please continue. Forgive me. It's wonderful so far. I mean,
Okay.
just soaking this all up. So
All
thank
right.
you
Well,
so
and I
much.
believe they have the slides. They should be
That's
available.
okay. It must be my machine.
Okay.
And it's all day. I've been seeing people's slides, so it must be something going on with me. I'll fix it. My apologies for interrupting you.
Okay. No problem. All right. Well, good. I'm glad it sounds like most people are seeing them. And I do believe since this one's recorded, and I think the slides are in wherever they have the slides available to you all to click on, so you can have these for your review in the future too. All right. So guilt and shame, again, going back to that idea of what I do versus who I am, instead of those, you know, having a clear boundary between them, sometimes they get meshed together and it feels like every action defines who we are. So that's where we can be in that space of either really blaming ourselves or other people. So feeling that shame so quickly and so intensely that we have to blame someone else in order to avoid that feeling, or accepting all of that blame in ways that hurts us and creates that shame. Now, the flip side of that is that we might have a great deal of ownership, that sense of accountability, and I made a mistake. I need to be the one to repair and fix that, which again can be a huge asset in all aspects of life, to be willing to be accountable, acknowledge how you may have played a role in something that was more negative, and figure out how to remedy that. Perfectionism is also a struggle in this area. So oftentimes when it comes to, not wanting to feel that guilt or shame, we go to that place of, I have to be absolutely perfect. And that way I'll never have to experience any guilt or shame. And if it could work that way, that would be great. But we all know it doesn't, right? So we're asking something impossible of ourselves. And what we can do instead is push that along the continuum to where it can be an asset and a benefit to us, to say that I'm someone who puts forth my best effort in all situations, right? Best is not the same as perfect, because we're human and we're going to make mistakes and have limitations. But trusting that we put forth our best effort is absolutely something that we can feel proud of, and helps to push away that guilt and shame. Now, continually prioritizing others over ourselves, that's another thing we tend to do. As adoptees, many of us tend to be very prone to experiencing guilt, right? As soon as someone else is experiencing discomfort or has needs, we go to that place of accommodating. And you'll notice, many adoptees work in helping professions, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it really fits with our natural tendencies. The trick is, again, to shift that down the continuum a bit, so that instead of it being all about others, we can view ourselves equally, and our needs matter just as much as someone else. And the ways that we can use that awareness are to have more empathy around how we impact others, be very vigilant around that. And again, that can be something that's incredibly positive in our world, to have someone who wants to be empathetic, who wants to understand how they're affecting the people around them. So that's something within this that we can own and feel proud of, to help push away that sense of guilt or shame. All right, grief. So like I mentioned, grief often involves mourning those unknowns, the what ifs, and can lead to this sense of a lack of closure, right? This idea that I don't have all the information that I need. And I find that to be true for so many adoptees I know. There is this sort of consensus, this inherent feeling of, I am missing some universal understanding that other people have. And it's because of a lot of these things, these 7 core issues, right? These things that abnormal experience that we had early on of separation, we're having normal reactions to it. But because we missed out on something normal in the beginning, it's something that leaves us feeling like we missed out. And so there can be this excessive need for reassurance in this area. Like, I need all the information. I need to know that what I'm doing is okay and it's not upsetting anyone. And a lot of that is just needing to not have any more what ifs. But like I mentioned earlier, the positive in that is that you might be really curious and inquisitive, and that can be something that's incredibly useful to you, that you get all of the relevant information. You're aware of what questions to ask. And that's a skill that's useful in so many jobs, so many experiences throughout life, and it's going to help you in relationships as well. Some of this, when we're on sort of that more difficult end of the continuum, can be something that looks more like paralysis with decision making. So, when you feel like you don't have all the information, or you always are wishing you had more, it can feel really difficult to make a decision, because you're wondering, oh, am I missing some important piece of information? Am I going to make the wrong decision? Kind of leads back to some of that perfectionism, right? But you can look at this on the other end of the spectrum as a huge positive, because that means you're going to be a very careful and deliberate decision maker. And again, that's something that is incredibly useful to you throughout your life, that you're going to be curious, try and gather as much information as you can, weigh all the information, consider the context, the impacts on others. That's something that's going to lead you to making decisions that are likely much more informed and better in the long run for you and the people around you. Now, there can be a lack of self-trust because of that sense that you're missing information and hold so many what ifs. And that lack of self-trust often affects our sense of identity, our sense of control. I can see the overlap again in all of these issues, how that can come up. But when we don't necessarily have full trust within ourselves and our intuition, that means the positive within that is that we have to imagine the larger context to try and fill in the gaps. Like, if I don't think that I know, what can I look to within the larger environment around me to help me fill in some of those gaps or help me build more trust in this decision? So, being able to imagine that larger context, again, is something that can be really useful when it comes to building that self trust, because you may find situations where you're not quite sure, but then the outcome is positive and it reinforces, oh, I can trust my intuition, or I do know more than I thought. So again, this is something that on that spectrum, it can be harmful or it can be incredibly useful. All right, identity. So when we're talking about that sense of who and where we come from, our purpose and meaning, um, a lot of times for adoptees, because we feel like we've missed so much early on, there can be a sense of difficulty forming our own opinions, right? So that need for reassurance, that lack of self-trust, a lot of times that can mean, okay, I want to avoid rejection or loss, so I'm just going to go along with everyone else and assimilate. But the flip side of that, that can be really positive, is that we can be very open to others' ideas, their thoughts, their experiences. So that sense of, if I'm not quite sure what I think or what my preference is, let me check in with the people around me and see what they think or what they're feeling. And that gives me more information to go off of. So that openness and receptivity is something that can make you a great friend, a great partner, a great employee. I mean, so many things that can be useful in. And a lot of that goes back to some of that curiosity that comes up too. Now, with identity, sometimes what happens is that there can be this idea of extreme makeovers. Like, I need to make sure that I'm assimilating in the ways that people around me are expecting. I want to do my best to just look like them, not feel any different at all. And so when that comes up, it can help you to, you know, when you think about it on the positive end of things, recognize that your willingness to make all these changes, do all of these things, actually shows that you are really ambitious, you're really creative, you might be sort of an out of the box thinker, even though you might be trying to assimilate, the ways that you're going about it are likely really innovative. So you can think about this again on this continuum, that there are ways that this can harm us, but also ways that they can be incredibly beneficial. And we want to own those ways that are beneficial. Being ambitious and creative are things that are incredibly useful throughout life. When you think about the ways that oftentimes our identity as adoptees, because we're trying to assimilate and we don't fully trust our intuition around who we are, there can be sort of this stereotypical or one-dimensional sense of self. Like, I see this especially for a lot of transracial adoptees of color who are living in predominantly white areas where they may not have a lot of racial mirroring. Sort of that sense of like, oh, I guess this is who I'm supposed to be because that's what I see in the media or that's what the people around me say. But this is true of all adoptees to some extent, right? Like trying to figure out who you are. Sometimes it means you're just going with the stereotypical depictions that are out there because that might be all you feel like you really have. And when you think about how adoptees are portrayed in media depictions, especially, I mean, there do tend to be very clear categories, right? The angry adoptee, the serial killer adoptee, the adoptee who is successful and well-adjusted and perfect, doing all those things. So it's, I mean, those categories are so minimal and really limited in what they actually offer us. You know, we're human beings first, so we don't fit into those categories no matter what. And as adoptees, it may make us more complex, but it still means that we're not going to fit a lot of those stereotypical categories. Now, what this means on the other end of the spectrum is that oftentimes we have a lot of empathy and sensitivity for anyone else who has non-traditional backgrounds, right? We recognize so clearly what it's like to feel different that we want to do our best to make sure no one else experiences that. And we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to help others feel like they're seen and like they have space to be themselves. So that sense of empathy and really recognizing what it's like to feel like you're not included or aren't seen for who you are, that's something again that puts us in a position to be incredibly just kind and compassionate and gentle with the people around us, and often much more accepting as well. All right, so I just want to check in and make sure there aren't any questions. I love all the comments that you all are sharing. This one is being recorded. Yep. And yep, empathy is definitely a superpower for many adoptees. All right, so let's move on to intimacy. So, like I said, intimacy, oftentimes you can think of it essentially as attachment, you know, how we are in relationships. And like I mentioned, so often there is this sense that we can't trust our own social awareness or social skills. Feeling like we're missing that inherent understanding somehow that is universally known to others. And so when we're in that place of feeling like we can't trust our own social competence, that means we tend to look to other people to get a sense of what are they doing and what's working for them, or how are other people receiving that. And that means we have really strong observational skills in social situations. So when we look at this on a continuum again, yes, that distrust of ourselves can be something that harms us. But when we slide all the way to the other end of the continuum, those strong observational skills are something that are going to be really useful to us as we engage with other people and, again, have that empathy and that compassion for them. And it also is something that means we're often really aware of small details that others may not notice, which can be incredibly useful. Now, sometimes when we're on the more harmful end of the spectrum with intimacy, it might mean that we are ending relationships in destructive ways or remaining in harmful relationships. Again, wanting to avoid rejection or another loss or change, wanting to make sure that we reject before we can be rejected. Those are things that can come up on the more kind of struggle end of the continuum. But on the other end of the continuum, it means that we're able to end unhealthy relationships. So what might be viewed as pathological by others if we're cutting people out of our lives might actually be a way that we are protecting ourselves from harmful people. And that is one way that I feel like adoptees, many of us can be very good at that, recognizing this person may not be good for me, so I'm not even going to start a relationship with them. Or recognizing just the harm that someone causes, that it's not worth the toll that it takes. And that also means that we can be really cautious when we're developing trust in new relationships, that I'm going to take my time. I'm going to use those strong observational skills to get a sense of who this person is and what they're like around other people. Are they kind of fake? Are they someone who seems authentic? Again, it's something that can be incredibly positive and useful to us when it comes to developing relationships long term, that we're able to really see who are the people that are safe for us. Okay, and then finally, control. All right, so like I mentioned, control is about safety and predictability. So not bad things, nothing stigmatizing, just wanting to know we're going to be okay. And sometimes because we had so little control over something so big early on in our lives as adoptees, we do everything we can to take back control in the present. So needing to know all the information, wanting to know exactly what to expect, wanting to try and make others be just as perfect as we think we should be. So sometimes that can look more like excessive bossiness or micromanagement when we're on that end of the spectrum where it's more harmful. As we shift to the other end of the spectrum, we recognize that can also mean that we're incredibly independent and strong-willed, right? That we have high standards, and that can be something that's really important and useful and helps us throughout life. There can be, kind of going back to that perfectionism piece, this pervasive fear of failure or mistakes, like, what could I possibly do wrong? What could I do to prepare and prevent and, imagine every possible scenario that could occur? Many of us are great planners and preparers because of that. And so that leads to that flip side of the continuum where we have this sense of responsibility over our decisions and our actions. So we feel that accountability and we feel that sense of like, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that this goes well. And as long as we're not putting ourselves in that place of feeling like anything imperfect, it equates to being a failure, it means that we're giving ourselves the credit we deserve. Like, hey, I did the best I could in this situation. I, took control over the things that I was actually able to influence, and I let go of the things that I could not. Now, sometimes when it comes to control, there can be this difficulty with requesting or accepting help. So, in order to be in control, sometimes we feel like the only person we can truly depend on is ourselves. And that can be something that's really useful because it's true. We can depend on ourselves. And like I said earlier, we are inherently social creatures. So we also need to be able to depend on others sometimes. It's impossible to survive on your own. We have to have community around us. So if we're not able to ask for help or accept help, it tends to cause us a lot of struggle. But the flip side of this, that if you are someone who is focusing on how you can take care of things, how you can handle them, that means you're likely also someone who is really confident in voicing your opinions, your preferences, what you need, what you expect of others. So again, that leads to this really clear communication that can occur and can be really useful in a lot of situations. All right, so we've talked about these 7 core issues. I'm gonna kind of see how we're doing that time. Oh, we're good. All right, I'm gonna open it up for a few questions before we go into some of the ways that you can kind of support yourself in discovering superpowers and others can help you. I want to give you all a chance to kind of process, ask questions, check in. I'll go back just so you can kind of see. Um, oops, there we go. Now the chat is quiet. Okay. So Yeah, adoptees who experience a lack of belonging, but those same people are willing to speak truth to power and won't just go along to get along. hmm Absolutely, right? Like it can be this trade-off. And like I had mentioned before, oftentimes the authenticity that can feel so important to us as adoptees because so much of our lives has been about masking and accommodating, and it feels very inauthentic. When we reach that point where we're able to be authentic and elevate our own voices and feel trust in that, there is a sense of empowerment in that for sure. And it can be lonely because a lot of people are not open to the truth or can't handle the complexity, especially of things like the adoption experience, the both and of so much of what we hold. So it can be a lonely space, and that makes it all the more important for conferences like this, finding community in spaces like this with other people who feel the same things and have experienced the same things. Okay, let's see. Keith, I see your hand up.
Oh yes, great presentation. I like what you said about how, sometimes the feeling of maybe we're the only one we could depend on, but then realizing that that's not really a bad thing. But of course, depending on others too, because for myself, there was a time when I literally felt like I couldn't depend on anybody.
Mhm.
Late discovery, all types of other crazy stuff. But then I'm like, maybe I'm the only one I could depend on. Then I'm like, if I could depend on myself, then maybe I could depend on others and maybe they could depend on me. It's like the
Mhm.
cycle, but it's kind of like I recalibrated my
Yeah.
thinking, and it's worked out at 45 years old. I'm finally getting it.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Keith. It definitely, there's an ebb and flow to it, like everything, like everything else in life, right? That we are going to have times when we feel a bit more siloed and want to depend on ourselves more, and then times when we're reaching out more and feeling that sense of community. And it's okay to go with the ebb and flow of that too. All right, let's see. Dr. Liz Tabetta, y'all, I just want you to know you can see her comments here. She's going to be presenting in the next session. You definitely want to check out what she shares as well. Yeah, it's definitely empowering where you can feel like that authenticity is there, but it's difficult when it's not welcome for sure. Yeah, both and. All right. So I'll keep an eye on the chat box. But I'm going to go ahead and keep moving through here. All right, so for adoptees, I want you to consider some of the ways that you can work on discovering your superpowers, reframing them in the ways you need to. So first of all, I think one of the most important things, like I said, so often what we experience is pathologized, right? The needs that we have, the ways we adapt. So instead of it being something that's labeled as pathologizing or self-sabotaging, right? Like rejecting before being rejected, instead of labeling that as self-sabotage, label it as self-protection and self-compassion. Because even things that seem really extreme, like for instance, substance abuse, right? Most people at face value would say, oh, that's harmful, that's self-sabotaging behavior. But when you flip that and reframe it to how is that self-protective? How is that self-compassionate? It usually means that you are experiencing something that's so difficult, you need an escape from it. Your body and your brain cannot handle it in that moment. You're doing what you can to take care of your needs to escape from that. And while it may not be the healthiest thing long term or the safest thing, you have to acknowledge the need underlying it is something that is compassionate, that you're trying to take care of yourself in the best way you know how in that moment. And that's true of almost everything. If you start to think about things that are labeled as self-sabotaging, when you reframe them as self-protective, you'll be amazed at how empowering it feels. Genius adaptations. I like that too, Darcy. It's a great term for that. Okay. So some of the ways that you can help reframe this idea to self-protectiveness. First of all, ask yourself why. When there's something that's happening and it's feeling really intense, or you're feeling kind of lost in how you're responding to it, or you don't like how you're responding, consider that it's probably just that you're on more of the struggle end of the continuum. And there are ways to slide it over to the superpower end, or those genius adaptations like Darcy mentioned. So asking why is important, because I feel like that's one of the main reasons why things that we do get labeled in a pathological way, that no one's asking why. They're just looking at it at face value. When you ask why and you understand the reasons, you can see the ways that it's actually self-compassionate. And oftentimes that means comforting your baby brain reactions. And so your baby brain, this is the way that I refer to it with my clients, but you might have heard of it, things like implicit memories, trauma memories, a lot of the things that you have memory of early on in your life, that pre-verbal trauma. And that can be something that you experience in utero, at birth, the first few years of life. But those baby brain reactions are things that can be triggered in the present. They can be activated again to try and protect you. Our baby brain might be the one that says, "Ooh, I can't trust anybody. Everybody else has left that I cared about or felt safe with. So I'm just going to stay, depending on myself. I'm only going to rely on me." But when you can check in, and instead of going, "Oh, that's stupid," or "Why am I doing this again?" Right? Going to that place of shame or pathology. Instead, if you can go, "Oh, that's my baby brain talking. Okay, I'm going to comfort you right now because I get that you're scared. You are feeling like, others are being distrustful or they're harming you somehow. So you're feeling afraid right now. And it's okay that you're feeling afraid. And you know what? I'm going to do what I can to take care of you and protect you right now. You're okay. You can rest right now because I've got this." So some of it comes down to, yep, inner child is another name for it. So some of this comes down to really being able to look at those parts of yourself that are reacting and check in, ask why, and consider what you can do with a response, because reactions are automatic. We can't help those. But the response is something that's intentional. It's something that we can choose. So when you ask yourself why and comfort your baby brain, it gives you an opportunity to engage in that self-compassion, take care of the parts of you that need it, and move forward without letting them feel like they're dominating everything in the present. So another aspect of this is to recognize that healing is a spiral and it exists within a larger context. So often, people start counseling or start the self-healing journey in some way, and they imagine it being linear, and maybe even not a straight line, but a wavy kind of line, but still linear. When truthfully, healing is much more like a spiral, right? We can do everything we can to try to prevent a situation from happening again, but life tends to be cyclical and it's going to throw a lot of the same things at us over and over again. That doesn't mean that we have failed in the healing process or that we're not making progress. What we need to look at is, how am I navigating through this time? How does it look different than the last time? What are the new coping strategies I'm using? What are the new ways I'm thinking about myself or the beliefs that I've developed in this? You'll often notice that you have moved away from the epicenter of that trauma or that struggle, and it's more like a spiral. You'll see that progress, that, oh, actually, this time I didn't immediately blame myself. I considered the circumstances, or this time I took responsibility and chose to handle it in a new way. When you can see it as a spiral, it tends to be more self-compassionate right from the get-go, because you're recognizing that you can't always control the circumstances that are occurring around you, and they're likely to happen again and again. But the way that you're navigating through them is different, and that's something that you can feel proud of and feel empowered by. All right, so the other piece of this too is making sure that you are surrounding yourself with people who are genuinely safe, not just nice. And there's a difference. I think many of us are taught that nice is all that we need to look for. Oh, that person's nice. So, I guess I should tell them my adoption story because they're curious and they're asking about it. Or that person means well, right? They have good intentions. So I guess I should just accommodate them. The problem with nice is that it's often more about protecting external peace instead of internal peace. Whereas authenticity is about being able to be real, be messy, be complex, have things be difficult to get through. And you can still be in a space with someone and they'll sit with you in that discomfort. They're willing to acknowledge their mistakes, work through repair, right? That's a safe person. And too often we have been trained to believe that nice is all that we should expect or all we need to look for, when truthfully, safe is what we need in order to discover our superpowers, to heal, to feel like we can be empowered and find our voices. And we need those people who are willing to sit with us in the hard things, be accountable for the ways they may have caused harm, and then allow us to move forward in a way that is taking our input into account and taking our needs and our comfort into account. So again, that sort of equal mattering of needs is something that should be occurring. And if you follow me on social media, you've probably seen that I have a whole set of slides comparing safe and nice people. Yes, absolutely, Anne-Marie, that idea of internal versus external piece, I think that's so important to be aware of. Let's see here. So I'm just going to go to a couple questions. So as far as unequating who we are with what we do when it comes to guilt and shame and perfectionism, a lot of that is this, being able to ask why, right? Check in with yourself, figure out where the reaction is coming from and how it maybe is useful in serving you or ways that it may not be as useful, and start to consider what you can do to separate out, this is what I do and this is who I am. And a lot of times that means really having to get to know yourself. What are the traits that I have? And so often we're not good at that. We look at the traits we have as, oh, I'm someone who's good at soccer and I'm really creative and artistic. And, but who we are is very different. Who we are is I'm someone who is compassionate and loving and dependable and imaginative. So we really have to have a strong sense of those traits that make us who we are, that sense of identity, in order to begin separating out our actions from that sense of self. Let's see. Yep, definitely nice is not always good. Weaponizing empathy. That's something that I think a lot of adoptees have seen happening. All right. So now I'm not sure if we have any non-adoptees here, but feel free to share these slides with people who are non-adoptees in your life to help them know how they can help you develop these superpowers as well. So when we talk about parents, professionals, other people in your life, some of the things that they can do to teach adoptees to develop those superpowers, a lot of it is about mirroring. So we need people around us who are role modeling really open, honest, and clear communication. So, being able to talk about things that are difficult without avoiding them, without trying to make them neutral or make them more comfortable. Adoption is not something that is comfortable. If we are being honest about it, it's messy. It's rarely something that feels like it's going to be easily reconciled or made sense in a simple way. We have to allow for the complexity, the wide range of all the emotions, the vulnerability, the ways that we're expressing our emotions around it and creating our narratives. the ways those narratives evolve over time. There needs to be space for all of that. And we need people who are open to talking with us in a way that allows for that space. We need to make sure that the people who are around us that are safe are also displaying confidence and self-trust so that we can see what it looks like to have someone who is self-assured, not someone who is constantly feeling like they need to accommodate or check in to make sure everyone else agrees or assimilate. We need to see that role model. What does it look like to have someone who is really confident and trusts themselves in a way that allows for healthy risk taking, right? So not being afraid of mistakes or failure, but also allows them to be aware of the needs of the people around them too, and taking that into account. So having realistic expectations of themselves, of other people, that they're not asking the impossible, right? Not asking the people around them to be perfect, but acknowledging that when someone is willing to take ownership over a harm or a mistake, that they can move forward with repair and be someone who's actually willing to fight for a relationship in a healthy way. So something else that's really crucial when it comes to parents and professionals, like I talked about, being a safe person, not just a nice person. So that means not only should we as adoptees be reframing for ourselves what's self-protective, but we need people around us who will almost be like accountability buddies and remind us of that when we're getting down on ourselves, when we're experiencing that guilt or shame, to have them say, hey, but why? What's the reason? What's happening underneath, and how is this meeting a need, and how can it be beneficial? People who can help us get to that place of recognizing how we can be self-compassionate. That's something that's going to help us build that self-trust and that trust in our intuition, and for us to more easily access the other side of the continuum where we can see these things as assets. We need people who are going to validate all of our emotions, right? The wide range of them when it comes to adoption, many of them which may seem like they contradict one another, but actually are all valid and all deserve their own space. We also need someone who can hold space for the things that can't be changed or fixed, right? Because that's what I find most often, is that the difference between nice and safe is nice is somebody who wants to say, oh, but it's okay because you ended up with, a family who took care of you and met your needs. And, it's okay that you didn't get some of these other things you needed. It's really more about them trying to manage their own discomfort instead of being able to comfort you in the ways that you need. And often what we need as comfort is someone to just say, you know what, you're right. This is hard. It sucks. It's difficult. Yes, maybe there were some benefits in your adoption, and there were a lot of really challenging and unfair things too. And we need someone who can sit with us in that instead of feeling like it has to be somehow wrapped up into this gift with a nice little bow that can be simplified and, okay, see here, it's a heartwarming story and everything turned out okay. We can't change or fix the past. And so we shouldn't be trying to revise what the impact was in the present. We need to acknowledge all parts of it in the present. So when they can sit in the discomfort with us, they can accept that our narrative is going to evolve. It's going to be very fluid over time. And that's absolutely normal and expected. And that should be the way that things go, because that's how everybody, adopted or not, builds a narrative of their lives. But that narrative has to shift and change and evolve over time in order to match where you're at in the present, to make sense of it. So we need people who can be present with that too, right? Not just, oh, when you were a kid, it seemed like you were fine with your adoption. Why is it a problem now, right? There has to be awareness that your understanding and your meaning around adoption will change over time. Right. And then trusting and believing adoptee experiences, right? That is crucial, that for whatever reason, when it comes to adoption, everyone thinks they're an expert. I don't know what it is, like reasonable people typically lose their tact and ask questions they would never imagine asking someone else that are really invasive. They think that they know more about adoption than someone who is part of the adoption constellation or who is adopted. It's a really strange thing. And it's one of those things as adoptees that it's a lifelong side effect to become an educator around adoption. It's not something we asked for, and it's not something we typically have the emotional bandwidth to offer. And we shouldn't have to be in that position. But at the same time, when we're finding people who are receptive and open and we trust that we can share with, we need to know that they unconditionally will believe what we are describing in our experiences as an adoptee, that they trust whatever we're saying is valid, it's true. They recognize it doesn't mean we're saying it's true for every adoptee, but that it's true for us, which means that it matters equally to anyone else. All right, so I have a few resources here. There we go. So some of the resources that I shared about, and I know I've thrown a lot at you today. So there's a lot percolating, a lot to process, and I want to give us a little bit of time to ask questions and talk about it. All right, I see a hand raised by iPhone. Not sure whose name, but if you want to, okay.
Yeah, just had a moment of clarity about superpowers. And that is, it was something you said about the people around us. And I think of my friend Betty, who was 43 years sober. And she did an inner healing thing. And she picked me for her church to do 8 sessions where they prayed for me about adoption and putting in God in the beginning where I was adopted with the mother and everything. It was called intercession. You know, they do that back in Seattle. The Episcopalians, I think, did it. It was to go back and recreate the wound and then see God in the beginning instead of the story I told where I was left and nobody wanted me, like little matchbook girl. But you said something that I was thinking of superheroes. I was thinking like Spider-Man, Batman, all those kind of people. And I was like, no, I can't really relate to that. But the one quality when you said somebody that listens to you, believes you, is the thing about Betty, because somebody else said it here early in the show. I decided I couldn't trust anybody because I would over trust and I would miss the cues and I would get hurt. And so I only trusted animals. Like I'm a dog walker in Hawaii. I just forget it. But I trusted her, and she had one quality, and it was sincerity. She was sincere. And when I got in a fatal car accident, I stayed at her house for 10 days and she was sincere. And that, when I dressed up on Halloween, we had to dress up in the person that we wanted to be the most. I dressed up like her. So in a weird way, she is like she's dead now, my superhero power, and it was her honesty and sincerity that made her a strong person, and genuineness. So I never got that until you said somebody that can listen to you, somebody that believes you, surround yourself, and that is a superpower. So anyway, I guess it doesn't have to be
absolutely.
Batman.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, absolutely. When we find those safe people, that can be such a positive and healing experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So some of these other resources that I mentioned, like certainly there are a lot out there, but the 7 core issues in adoption and permanency, that's a great one. And like I say, you can Google the 7 core issues and find a lot of articles and information as well. Books, any of these ones that talk about flipping the script are always great because they're focusing on the adoptee voice and elevating that and promoting our experiences, our lived experience as expertise. There are a couple of young adult books that I think are really great too. So When We Become Ours is a newer one that's out for YA. An earlier one from several years ago is Dear Wonderful You, Letters to Adopted and Fostered Youth. I have a book, a children's book called Marie Discovers Her Superpowers, which is all about how do you respond to other people's adoption comments and questions. Essentially all the tools I wish I would have had as a kid in those moments when I felt like a deer in headlights. If you know Adoptee's on, Haley Radke's podcast, that's an incredible space to learn about the wide range of adoptee experiences, and oftentimes to find things that resonate for you, to learn new things, to have your mind opened to experiences that were different from yours. I think it's a place that can be incredibly healing and powerful just to listen to those voices of other adoptees. And Haley is an adoptee as well. And then a space for a lot of resources is ICAV, Intercountry Adoptee Voices. For those who are adopted internationally and even domestically, they have a ton of resources, videos, even videos for professionals. So if you have potentially like a therapist or someone you're working with who maybe isn't as adoption informed as you would like, there's the opportunity to say, hey, here are some resources to learn about this so that you don't have to be the educator for your therapist. All right, so I'm gonna open this up to more questions again. I'll offer up, there's my website if you're looking for some of the resources I have too. And yes, I saw your comment earlier, Timothy. A lot of why we come to adoptee groups, all of this, right? To feel heard, to feel seen, to feel like we can be authentic. It's so necessary. And at this point too, feel free if you want to unmute. I'm going to ask that if you have spoken already, try and give space to people who haven't shared yet. Or if you want to type something into the chat, feel free to do that.
It looks like iPhone might have a hand up. I'm not sure if that's the same person from before.
It is. I'm gonna wait just to give space to
Perfect.
others first.
Perfect. No, I just wanted to make sure.
No,
I just wanna
I
thank
just
you.
forgot to put it down. I'll put
That's
it
what I
down.
thought. Okay, good. That's what I thought. Okay, good. I just want to thank you. Your work and your resources are amazing. Showing up and being here with all of us.
Of course.
After a long week is really a blessing. So
Yeah, absolutely. We have to continue to hold space for each other in all of this. Yeah, thanks, April. And I realize it's probably been a long day for everyone too. So there's probably still a lot of processing happening from everything throughout the day. Oh, thank you very much, Marty. I appreciate that. I like to think that can be a superpower for me to be really clear and offer that compassion in clear ways. Good. I'm so glad that this felt affirmative for you, something that you can use in the future if maybe you are going through that ebb and flow and need a boost. Yeah. Oh, thank you all. You're definitely making me feel like I have superpowers. I appreciate that. Yes, absolutely. The reframing is key. So many of the narratives out there, we know that they involve misconceptions around adoptee experiences and identity. We have to be the ones to reframe it because no one's going to do that for us. So when we can start to put that out into the world, that whole idea of flipping the script, that's what's going to help others understand us in a more accurate way. Absolutely, Tina. It's a lot to process. And especially if you've been attending all day, I'm sure there's so much that's percolating. So absolutely take some time to kind of consider and just to let it all settle in and see what resonates.
I'm just gonna jump in and reiterate thanks for the reframing, and also, that as much as these are things that are helpful for younger adoptees who are still grappling with early, identity experiences and like just developmental stuff, they're really powerful reminders for us as adults. Like I'm sitting here and thinking like, wow, I needed to hear this because there's so much validation in looking at that reframe and thinking about it as a continuum and recognizing that some of this it applies in all aspects of life. Like I'm having a particular situation at my workplace where these people are not safe, right? And so my baby brain has taken over and has done a lot of these protective things. And so just to hear all this reframed in the way that you've reframed it for us is really validating that, like, no, these are real things that are happening. There are safe and unsafe people, and I know who the safe people are. And so it's just a reminder for all of us to listen to ourselves, to keep listening to ourselves, because those survival things that come up are the way our nervous systems respond to things are hugely telling, and ignoring them can be really damaging. And also, like, I was thinking about control and like controlling the controllables, and sometimes that's like a really important strategy when you're in a situation where you're feeling like in a constant trauma response, which has been my reality for a while. That I'm like, okay, what are the things I control, right? And like I can control my home environment, I can control the things I cook for dinner. And so like reminding myself that those are helpful, healthy tasks that I am capable of, and that like big me can take care of little me, super important. So I just want to thank you for giving me more language to also use to talk about this in my own work. So thank you.
Absolutely. You're welcome. I love the ways you shared about that, some of the examples. I think that's so true that, the things that we learn early on can be changed and can be adjusted over time to fit where we are right now. And yeah, when we can kind of reframe that lens of like all these things that I've done to cope before, they work. And sometimes we need to add or adjust those. And, being able to shift the language sometimes allows us to get out of the routine of coping that we've been in to find new ways to cope. And oftentimes it does take spaces like this because we get so used to our routines. And even when they're helping us, maybe there are things that could help us even more. But yeah, that exposure is so necessary. And I will admit, the reason that I think our baby brain is so important is because we can be so harsh, like we're our own worst critics. But when we think of a baby, we are not likely to be as harsh, right? When we think about comforting our baby selves, there's automatically going to be a softness and a gentleness to it that we don't use with our older selves. Yeah, I'm so glad that this is resonating for you all and offering what you needed, what you were hoping for. Okay. So I know we're a little bit early, but I know that there's been a lot for you today, and there's still one more session, including Dr. Liz, her session. So I'm going to go ahead, since I don't see any other questions coming up. April, do you have anything that you want to add?
I think we do have a meeting, I think a survey
Okay.
that we need to pop in the chat. I don't know, Brooke, if you're able to do that. I'm not sure. She may not be able to. Give me 1 second. Let me try to pull it up. But I just, again, want to thank you for the space and time and
Yeah.
all of the all of the things. So,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
like refreshing today, you know, like you just really, really amazing. And I think it was Dr. Liz who was saying, uh, you know, it's for young people and adolescents, it's certainly, an amazing thing to reframe these. But you know, it's just like it's so important for me at this point in this age and stage of life. I go, oh, like I remember, like, oh yeah, but I'm pretty good at these things, you know, and reframing them. So it's kind of gives me like it just gives me a little boost of energy to be like, okay,
Yeah.
like so
Yeah.
much
Sort of
appreciated.
like reminding you to be your own cheerleader, right? Like we all
Yeah.
need that person in our lives, and we can be that person for ourselves sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I wonder, one thing I think it would be interesting, is like I want to get into a practice of when I'm in space with other adopted persons, even more intentionally than I do already, like naming that, like being very clear about saying, oh, that skill, or and in the moment, you know, just helping to shift that a little bit. I think that's something that's one commitment I can make out of this space, is like, you know, a reminder of really the amazing capacities that we have that are often pathologized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no denying the trauma and the adversity, but all of the skills that come out of that and the traits that come out of that, we get to fully own those. We have earned the right to those. So we can definitely celebrate the ways that we have survived and thrived. And that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge the trauma.
Well, again, thank you so much for holding space for us with us, and everybody that was here all day. And we do have another session coming up, the breakout. So look forward to seeing folks there. And thanks for a great
Yeah,
session and great day so far.
yeah. Oh, I was going to respond to one more note
Sorry.
in the
Oh,
one more. Let's see. Oh yeah, a t-shirt collection would be great, Dr. Liz, for sure. We need that. And then, oh, and Tina, so actually you can listen to me read Casey Conquers Bedtime on my website. There, I do an author read along. So there's a video for that. Yeah, thank you all. I think I've gotten to, I hope I haven't missed any questions there, but thank you all so much for being here today and for engaging and sharing and being open to recognizing your superpowers. I'm just so appreciative of you all for joining. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference too.
Take care. Thanks again for your time.
Yeah, of course.